Get to know Alan Caron on News Radio WGAN.
Again here at WGAN with yet another gubernatorial candidate interview. And joining us for this conversation is independent candidate for governor Alan Caron, who was nice enough to join us here this morning.
Glad to be here.
Great to have you, Alan. Thanks so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We're doing these with all the candidates, and as I've told you just a moment ago, and the other candidates as well, this is a little bit different. We've been, sort of inundated with debates and policy conversations, and I'm sure you're going to have a million interviews on, the various TV news channels where they'll ask you the same questions over and over again about policy.
Yeah.
But rarely do we get an opportunity, though, to get to know, like for real, the candidate and get a little bit of their story and sort of learn a little bit about their background and their motivations and sort of who they are and how they think and that kind of thing. So our plan with this series of conversations is we'll get into a little bit of policy, I suppose, but we really want to learn more about you. And so Alan's here and nice enough to tell us a little bit more about himself. And my first question, I guess, is the same to all of you, but it circulates around your background, how you got to the point where you are today. Obviously everybody has a different path running for governor. Everybody has a different life story, but you have a really, really seriously unique one and an interesting one that I don't think a lot of people know, because Janet Mills, kind of a known commodity.
Yeah.
Sean Moody, pretty known commodity. I mean, he just went through a primary and kind of had TV commercials,
right.
And we've known him for years, because he's run for governor before and everything else. And even Terry Hayes, to some degree, is a sort of known commodity. But Alan Caron is not known, I think, to the general public as much as the other candidates are. So let's get into it. I mean, your story is unique and interesting. So let's begin at the beginning. Where did Alan Caron come from?
Yeah.
Where'd you grow up? And tell us sort of about your early life.
I come from the south end of Waterville, which is a Franco-American community.
Good people.
Good people.
Franco-Americans.
Yeah. In a family of mill workers and farmers. Basically, all my uncles worked in the paper mills. I had aunt and uncle working Edwards and Augusta, another branch of the family in Lewiston shoe mills. My mother worked at Hathaway. Nobody in my family, my mother's generation, my father's generation, had more than an 8th grade education. And I grew up as the kid who somehow was able to figure things out and someone that helped to explain things. I sort of grew up as a translator. For my family and my community, something I've been doing all my life.
Well, you say translator too, and I know what you meant by that, but also Franco-American family. Was this my family? My dad spoke French until he was about 12, and then he learned English later.
Same with my mother.
Yeah,
and my stepfather was a translator back in the Second World War. So I was the first in the lineage not to be taught French. I came,
Sure.
as happened in families at that time, everybody was supposed to become an American.
Right.
And so my older brother and sister went to parochial school. I went to public school. They knew French. I wasn't. I was expressly not taught French, which I wish had not happened. But there it is. And it happened with kids at my age all across the state, really.
We're different ages, but that same story happened with my family. I was never taught French at home. My father married a non-Franco-American, so they didn't speak French among each other, and so I grew up as a full American speaking English in school and never really even getting it. And then you'd go to like a family event, and you'd hear it, being talked back and forth, and kind of confuse you, and you'd hear a couple words you recognize, but
in our community at that time, we had a French theater, French school. I mean, the language was very prominent, but the generation that spoke French, my mother didn't speak any English until she went to first grade, and then she had to speak English. So it was very prominent. It's sad that we've lost it. It has aged out in a certain sense. So in the kitchen of our apartment building were 2 pictures on the wall. That the same 2 pictures were on almost every wall in that whole neighborhood. One was Jesus, the other was John F. Kennedy.
right.
So I grew up at that time of a great inspiration by John F. Kennedy, and that in many ways is directly why I became a Democrat for most of my life. And I
Very common in the Franco-American community. That was the same story with my father.
I consider myself in some ways, or did for many decades, a JFK Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
We can get into why I left the Democratic Party at some point. But so I went to South Grammar School for 6 years, and went on. I left school 2 months into the 9th grade, mostly because I wasn't getting what I needed in the school, and I wanted to go into the world.
Yeah.
Became a rock and roll musician, loaded tractor trailer trucks on the night shift at Harris Baking, worked in Edwards and Augusta, taking machinery apart that was being shipped to North Carolina along with our jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So small part of a big machine, not realizing what was going on. You know, as a teenager, I got myself on the wrong side of the law. I got in with some wild folks, and we did some particularly wild things. And I ended up spending 8 months down in Wyndham at the Correctional Center.
This was for receiving stolen goods, I believe it was.
Yeah. It turned out to be, in hindsight, a perfect timeout for me, because my life was so frenzied and wild, and it was 1969, 1970. The whole country was crazy, as far as I'm concerned, and I along with it. But while I was there, I got to take stock of who I was and what talent or skill I'd been given, and what exactly I was going to do with it. And it was clear that I was just frittering away my skills. And so I came out of there first committed to improving prisons. It's the first thing I did. And
was that based on your experience while you were in there?
Yeah. One of the things, in this correctional center, there were a series of shop programs, just like you used to have in high schools, right?
Kind of
I
teach you
got
trade,
put in a carpentry program, and I had by then become a carpenter. So I didn't need the training. There were a lot of guys there who did. I mean, they just didn't have any skills. And without skills, they weren't going to make it when they got out.
Right, kind of fall back into the same traps.
They had the equivalent of a high school shop, where in a high school might take 15, 20, 25 students. In this place, 5. And all 5 were skilled carpenters. It's all designed to make the program look good back to the legislature. Sure. Now, the other problem going on when I was there was corruption. All 5 of us and many, many others were doing work of personal benefit to the warden, to the guards. I personally was taking furniture that had been found at the local dump, brought to me, and I would refinish it, and it would go to the warden. So when I got out of there, the first thing I did, not knowing anything about politics, I heard there was a legislative hearing in Augusta on these programs at Wyndham and whether they were working. And I went up there and blasted away, only by telling the truth of what was happening, that we had crews cutting hay that was going to farms owned by guards, that we had crews working in the woods, the wood was being sold, that we had people like me working furniture. It went on and on. I mean, it was a completely corrupt prison. And what happened was the warden got fired.
Really?
And a bunch of other people got fired. So I still take some pride in my first political action was exposing the misuse of funds down there, and which was not only hurting taxpayers, it was hurting people who needed help.
Well, sure. I mean, that strikes me as the kind of thing, you know, you can be as tough on crime as you want to, but ultimately what you want to have happen is after the time is served, I mean, there's a variety of different people in there for violent crime, nonviolent crime, whatever. You want them to get out and not ever go back again, right? To be productive in some fashion. And if that's not...
Especially in, a correctional center is a sort of first-time offender. You had a chance to turn things around. You're not a hardened criminal. It's not violent crimes.
And beyond that,
there was a lot of guys when I was there because of possessing small amounts of marijuana.
Right.
That was a felony offense at that point.
Well, beyond that too, I mean, you're talking about, you're not talking about watching TV in prison and having a comfy couch and all the other things that people criticize. This is learning a skill. I mean, that's not. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with somebody learning how to become a carpenter or a machinist or something.
Okay, look. I went on. I may not be well known to the public, but I've spent 35 or 40 years of my life in various initiatives, campaigns, organizations, trying to make Maine a better place.
Yeah.
So I went from the prison reform to being president of the Munjo Hill Neighborhood Organization, where I lived, Munjo Hill in Portland, built that into a sizable organization, went on and did a lot of work in energy, transportation, virtually every issue that's critical to Maine's future. Mm-hmm. In the last 15 years, I spent, I built 2 substantial statewide nonprofits, one called Grow Smart Maine that now is in Gardner, I believe. We brought a group called the Brookings Institution to Maine for a big report called Charting Maine's Future. That inspired me to focus more of my attention on the economy. After that report, I did over 100 speeches across the state, in every place from Kittery to Frenchville, some places multiple times, about building a new economy in Maine. The last 5 or 6 years, I created another group called Envision Maine, whose mission was to first support innovators, entrepreneurs, the doers of Maine, for a sort of small business innovation economy, but mostly to pull large groups of people together across the political spectrum who share a love of Maine and who want to find common ground solutions to Maine. So, and of course, also the last 5 or 6 years, I wrote a weekly column in the Sunday Telegram, the Augusta, and the Waterville papers on whatever issue I felt like writing about. So I did everything from politics to the economy to sports to culture.
Yeah, it's certainly something I understand as a columnist too. It's quite an opportunity to be able to give a voice to some of the ideas in your head. We'll get back to some of those as well because we have a lot of time here to talk. And I'd like to go back a little bit though. You're talking about the early portions of your life, getting into a little bit of trouble, and then turning yourself almost into an activist after that experience. And it strikes me as listening to your story that one of the things that probably made it so effective when that happened is that you had the experience. You were inside that environment, and so when you went to the legislature to say, hi, I was there, I just saw this is what's actually happening.
Right. That's right.
It's not something that they're exposed to a lot. Usually they have, like, if anything, an interest group or somebody who
they've never
studies it from the outside.
I mean, the idea that somebody would come out of there and be able to articulate what they saw was enormously powerful.
Yeah, I bet it was.
Not only to the legislature, both the Sunday Telegram and the BDN did major feature stories that ran for weeks on what had been uncovered there. I just opened the lid, and once other people got in closer, then they found.
Well, it seems like a spotlight, right? I mean, you probably got their attention, and then they said, "Well, let's look into this a little bit," and then they found, the details that.
Now, the other thing is, I've kind of, while I've had this sort of advocacy nonprofit career, I've also built 2 small businesses, and one of them I've had since 1978. It's had as many as 10 employees, and that was a consulting business in strategic planning. So my clients have been everything from a wide array of small businesses to Bath Iron Works in its modernization. So that has given me an entirely different set of experiences. So I like to say that I've had the advantage of seeing Maine from the bottom.
Yeah.
And I've had the advantage of working for Maine at the top with CEOs all across the state and partnering with every one of the Envision Maine events, partnered with at least 30 different organizations. So it gives me a unique perspective on what our challenges are and I suppose more importantly, what the opportunities are.
Now, you talked about your education there briefly, and how you essentially left high school to kind of go out in the world and experience it, but you continued that education later. I mean, you went to the Harvard School.
I did a one-year master's program at the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard, and I was, and I think remain, the only person ever admitted to that 1 year.
Was it something they discontinued later, or is it still, does nobody use it? I mean,
did I ever use it?
Well, no, I mean, I'm saying the 1 year program. Is that something that they no longer have?
No, it's a big prominent part of the program.
Oh, okay.
They have a what's called a mid-career program, 1 year.
Okay.
And, so I literally went from ninth grade to a 1 year master's program.
Right. Did you have to do anything? Like, did you have to get a GED along the way and all that?
I did get a GED when I was in Portland, but only because I was in a program that paid me $40 a week to go to the GED school, and I ended up teaching math there. So, I'm a self-learner. I consume information. And my wife's always complaining that I've read 5 papers in the morning before she gets up. That's a lifelong habit. I've had to learn myself. And part of why I left school is I was learning faster than the school could keep pace.
Right.
At that point, there weren't programs for people who were quick learners. So I did the 8-month program. Ironically, I spent 8 months in Wyndham and 8 months in Harvard. Both formative experiences in completely different ways. Yeah. But both left me understanding the world better. Yeah. And understanding how people work. And
that's a pretty unique story. I got to tell you, to not even, to go from high school not being completed, knowing undergraduate in the middle, and then getting a master's degree. That's frankly amazing. Do they even let you do that anymore? I mean,
well, I know they had never done it before. Yeah. It was a 4-month struggle within the admissions committee. And I don't know if they've done it since. I don't think they have.
Yeah.
And it was a national story at the time. I was on CBS Morning News with Diane Sawyer and featured in USA Today. So, it's a I don't advise this route for anyone else. But look, I just think I've been able to do so many things and learn so many things, and bring it all back to my love of Maine. And so, what can we do? So I don't tend to think about policy so much as people. That's really what.
So let me ask you this then. I mean,
by the way, I've never worked in Augusta or run for office or lobbied. I just don't. That's not the way I. Almost everything I've done is about engaging people, helping to educate ourselves and move forward.
So, going to the Harvard School of Government, obviously, there's an interest in public affairs in some fashion there, and you just spoke about, of course, your experience with prison reform. Was there anything else? I mean, was there anything else that called you to it? I mean, was this something that you had a sort of early experience that made you fall in love with politics? I know the John F. Kennedy, picture on your wall probably didn't hurt, but was there something that really drove your interest in politics beyond those things?
It took me a long time to be interested in politics, small p. Right. Really, I was active in issues at the neighborhood level. I brought solar power into an urban neighborhood at Munjoy Hill, which had never been done. So I did a series of innovative things there. And I went on to work on other issues. I had a friend who ran for office. That sort of sucked me into the politics of it. His name was Tom Andrews. He was on my board of the Munjoy Hill group. And he ran, so I helped him run for legislature and state senate, and United States Congress, and
then U.S. Senate later, right? Yeah.
What's that?
And then he ran for U.S. Senate later.
Yeah, he ran for U.S. Senate, which I had urged him not to do, and he did nonetheless. But, that's probably what got me into politics, and then it went on from there. The last time, and part of my business for a while was running political campaigns, and doing polling and communications and all that work. So the last campaign I did was in 1994, when two people wanted me to work for them. One was Joe Brennan, one was Angus King. And I decided to go with Joe Brennan, mostly because my whole family adored him.
Yeah.
They did. And I had never really been on the same place with my family. It was a very personal decision. If I had it to do over again, I would have gone the other way.
I mean, Brennan's an interesting figure. I was reading the story that Al Diamond wrote about you a while back.
Yeah,
he was kind of breaking down a lot of these stories about your past. I think he had mentioned in there that you actually had gotten a pardon for Brennan. Is that?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, again, I was the president of the Munjoy Hill Neighborhood Organization. He was from Munjoy Hill. I had him. Bill Cohen lived on the hill at that time. I had a lot of speakers come in,
yeah.
And I wasn't partisan at all about it, but I had him in a couple of times because he was a prominent figure, and he had me speak at the Elks once to a alumni of Munjoy Hill group. So we got to know each other, and I don't remember if I mentioned it or he mentioned it or somebody mentioned it at one point. I should apply for a pardon. Thought really hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah.
It's sort of like getting a degree from Harvard. I had no practical use. I wasn't doing it because I needed a degree.
Sure.
And I didn't do the pardon because I needed a pardon, but I was persuaded that it's a useful thing. I've never really talked about it since then, but there it is.
Yeah. Well, obviously, your life has circulated around public affairs for a long time. Anybody who's followed Maine politics for a while, seen your name on a book or has encountered you in some fashion. And I think that I've of course read both of the publications you've put out before, and we'll get to those I think a little bit. But you mentioned that you would have gone the other way with Angus King, and I've noticed he did the foreword to the second book.
Yeah, that's right.
I believe, if I remember right. And I know that he's been sort of tied into your universe a little bit there. Why don't you talk to me about your relationship with Senator King?
Yeah, Angus and I first connected when I was doing Grow Smart Maine and brought Brookings up. And I had this vision of getting a large study done by people who weren't from here, who could compare us to other states. And he got enthusiastic about it. And so we worked together. We raised some money together. We did some joint presentations, and we got to know each other. And he never lost an opportunity to rib me about working against him. But I like to think we've become good friends through the years, and it's helped me to better appreciate the work he did as governor, which some of the partisans on both sides don't like, but the general public liked pretty well. He wrote the foreword to one of the books. I hadn't mentioned it along the way. I've co-authored 2 books since 2006. One came directly out of the Brookings report. And Brookings, when I brought them here to Maine, they initially said, you got to do this. Maine's got to invest in this. You got to spend $100 million here, $200 million there. So I said, time out. Don't tell us where we should spend money unless you first tell us where the money comes from.
Yeah.
And they were like thunderstruck. Nobody had ever insisted that they do that, which I think is kind of real world,
right. Sure.
So they went.
Is that the Reinventing Maine Government one that they were involved with? Or?
Yeah, well, that.
Yeah.
I subsequently co-wrote Reinventing Maine Government after what they did. So Brookings then looked at Maine to figure out where money would come from, and they began to discover that we were highly inefficient in government, that we spent more of our income, a high percentage of our income on government than just about any rural state in Maine. So they said, become more efficient, save money, then invest the money in research and development, small business, all of that stuff. Okay, but they also said, we're just skimming the surface here. You got to go deeper. This is a big problem for Maine. So after that was done, I spent a couple of years writing a book called Reinventing Maine Government, which compared us to rural states across the country. I tried not to go into it with any anti or pro bias about government. I just wanted to know what the facts were. And, we've been told for decades that we're we spend a lot of money on government because we're big and rural and cold. Okay, fine. If that's true, other similar
big rural cold
states that are cold,
of which there are
should
some.
do the same thing. And look, the takeaway, it wasn't a Democratic or Republican takeaway. It was a factual takeaway. We spend more and get less, plain and simple. And we couldn't find a rural state that spent as much as a percentage of our income on government. We just couldn't find it. So there are a few areas where we spend less. Higher education was one of them. But overall, the what it tells you is not so much that we expand eligibility for social programs. It tells you some of that, but mostly it's that we have too much administration. We're just too inefficient. Now, we know some of this. We have 500 towns. We have 16 counties. So the list goes on and on of ways in which we're inefficient, and we're always trying to become more efficient. But so that's what that book was about. And ironically, it took me in a completely different direction because I worked with Bruce Poliquin on it.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
I know that you'd had some partnerships that were interesting.
Yeah. Bruce Poliquin grew up across the street from me in Waterville.
Yep.
After we moved, just to go back to my family for a minute. So when I was a kid, everybody, all of the families, my aunts and uncles and nieces, and cousins, everybody lived in an apartment. 15, 20 years later, everybody lived in their own house.
Right.
We all went up with the expansion of the middle class in the 60s and 70s. It happened to all of us. So when we got our own house up on Violet Avenue, Bruce Poliquin lived across the street. He was the younger brother. His older brother was a rock and roll musician that I played music with.
Oh, yeah.
A brilliant guitarist. And he's the one that Bruce sometimes talks about who succumbed to drug abuse.
Yep.
Brilliant guy. So now back to 2010. I want to do this book on reinventing Maine government. Bruce was helpful, and then Bruce became involved with Paul LePage's administration.
Right. When he lost that primary, he went all in on Paul pretty quick. Yeah.
And I knew Bruce from past campaigns when he was more of an environmentalist. He was on the board of the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and he was a Little League coach. Is how I knew him. So I was surprised to see him launch into politics and then sort of veer more conservative. But there he was, and he introduced Reinventing Maine Government to Paul LePage, who, as I understand, read it twice and really liked it.
Yep.
I don't know if that's true, but I know that one day I got the call from Paul saying, I need you on my transition team, and will you chair the long-range budget planning committee?
Mm-hmm.
I said...
so this is after he won?
After he won.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I said, yeah, so look, I'm from Waterville, but I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
And so let me think about it. And then I called some people that I trust, and I called Angus, in fact, and what should I do? And he said, you can't talk about being nonpartisan, and then when a governor calls and asks you for help, you say, what party are you in?
Yeah.
You have no choice. You have to do this. So I did it. I volunteered my time for 2 months. I chaired a committee. We came up with a unanimous set of recommendations on the long-range budget thing. Much of it came out of Reinventing Maine Government, including fully funding the pension plan, paying your bills on time, common sense stuff like what most of us do. Stop using hospitals as an ATM. Stop using delayed payments in general as an ATM or credit card. So, it was not an easy experience. There were a lot of people there around him that had deep mistrust of anyone who was or had been a Democrat.
Right.
But I did my job, and I did it as well as I could.
There's got to be some sort of element of you can't impact public policy if you don't show up to that. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you were asked to
Yeah,
have a
that's
hand in
right.
it,
That's right.
and maybe it's not 100% what you want to see happen everywhere. But I mean,
Yeah.
you get a chance to get in there and do something, and you
Yeah.
might as well take it, right?
Yeah, and my Democratic friends all thought I'd gone over to the dark side, and it was fine. I mean, so
Well, Ken talks about that all the time. He said, if Donald Trump called you up and you don't like Donald Trump at all or whatever, and said, hey, I'd like to hear some of your advice on what to do.
Yeah.
How do you say no to
Hello,
that? I mean,
right.
would you rather have somebody
Right.
that you
Yeah.
disagree with entirely on everything giving him that advice? Why don't you do it? Go get up there.
So I haven't only talked the talk on crossing the aisle. I've actually done it, But I went on later to co-author another book with a bunch of other authors called Maine's Next Economy, and that's the one that I'm most proud about. This is, again, after years of assembling these large groups, chambers of commerce, environmental groups, laborers, all of it. It sort of crystallized, how do we build a 21st century economy in Maine? And that book is still available on Amazon. They charge too much for it. I don't get a penny from the sales because Amazon takes 100% of whatever you pay. I'm trying to rewrite it now so there's fewer pictures and will cost less money, and then I'll buy a bunch of them and we'll distribute them. And I invited 13 or 14 good thinkers that on the economy from across the state to write a chapter in whatever they specialize in.
Yep.
Angus wrote the foreword. And I've been talking about that ever since. So those two books define what my priorities are, right? Build a 21st century economy and a 21st century efficient government. Mm-hmm. That's where it all starts.
I want to get back to, in a moment, sort of how you drifted towards independence and whatnot. But since you just brought that up, I think it is worth talking about a little bit, sort of your philosophy on what you'd like to do, your agenda, where you want to go, where you want to take the state. And, you've talked an awful lot about a lot of those issues for a while, about the inefficiencies of government and also what you need to invest in. What are your priorities? I mean, what is the defining character of what you would like to do as governor?
Top priority of the economy is and always will be. And I think we've got to, at long last, let go of trying to rebuild the past. The mills are not coming back.
Yeah, you've talked about that a lot, about how we've sort of been looking backwards.
Yeah, we spend a lot
at what we used to be.
And look, we've made a lot of investments in Maine in trying to recreate the past. It has been woefully unsuccessful. You can point to a few things, I suppose, that have worked, but by and large, we're making big investments. We're not getting any return. So I want a pro-growth government in Maine, but I want to be very specific about where we put our limited dollars to grow jobs. And I don't want to have any more of this. We'll just write checks to people because they say nice things, or they make big promises. I think that era has to end. The whole series of things, I've just put out a paper on this, but the most immediate thing we can do is to direct our tax breaks to people who actually create jobs. We spend as much as $500 million every year in Maine on tax breaks to generate jobs. But we never measure the effects of them. Both parties have agreed we'd rather not measure the effects. So it makes for great political events, headlines. What's at the tail end? Like what is being produced? And so there's a very simple solution.
Let me stop you there too, because there's plenty of time to expand on your thoughts on this. But when you look at some of what Governor LePage has tried to do over the past 8 years or so, he's sort of, I wouldn't say taking the opposite path, but like he seems to want to get rid of tax carve-outs in some ways. He's been trying to limit them and bring them, when it came to the sales tax, for instance, he's trying to expand what it applies to. And as part of how he funded some of the tax cuts that he wanted to do on the income tax side of things. Yeah. And on the income tax side of things, there's a lot of deductions he tried to get rid of that got fought in the legislature, and you had everybody from the realtors to, everybody who has a special carve out in there. I mean, talk to me about carve outs. I mean, is a carve out a good policy to do? Does it not lead to all of our taxes being a little bit higher because we have to do little carve outs to people who are creating jobs?
That's right. No, look, I'm not a big fan of Christmas tree approach to carve outs.
Right.
I think it's a disaster. But on the specific issue of how we invest in job creation, this is what that form of tax breaks that we call it pie tree zones, or we call it whatever, and we do it one company at a time. Bath Iron Works, Cape Capital up in Millinocket. I want to wipe that system out. I don't want to wipe out tax breaks for job creation. I just want better results. And the way to get better results is simply to change the system so you're not giving people money in advance for promises. You're giving them tax breaks once they produce jobs. That takes away all of the press conferences, the political lobbying, the insider deals. All that stuff goes away. So, look, if you have a company with 2 people, you should get 2 tax credits, assuming that halfway decent jobs. If your Bath Iron Works with 6,000, you should get 6,000 tax credits. It's very simple, and we can do it on people's tax returns. There's a lot of resistance to that idea because it takes politics out of what we're trying to do. And I think politics is the last arbitrator of where jobs will get created. Mm-hmm. It's the last place to figure it out. And every time we try through politics to pick winners and losers, we're on the wrong side. Because we can't, the government isn't set up to do that. It doesn't have the skill sets to do that, and it does it poorly. So I would like for every small business in Maine that's actually creating and sustaining decent jobs to get the same tax breaks that Bath Iron Works would get. I don't want to take away Bath Iron Works tax breaks. I want the same treatment for everyone else. So that's on the economic side. There's lots more to talk about there. What are we doing? So that's the first priority. The second one is to build an efficient, a smarter government, right? So there's a whole lot of things to do there. The third priority for me is education, and that's pre-K all the way up to higher education. We're still operating what is essentially a 20th century education system, but it's not keeping up with the economy. And the fourth priority for me is energy. We export about $5 billion a year for oil and gas in this state. We have 4 sources of energy that we produce: wind, water, wood, and solar. One of those is on the verge of a transformative change. That's solar. We get as much solar energy as southern France does. We have to commit ourselves to energy independence. Now, that's not a 4-year plan or an 8-year plan. That's a 25 or 30-year plan. But if we could save half of the $5 billion that we now export for gas and oil and reinvest it in Maine businesses and in Maine education, it would have a transformative, uplifting effect on Maine. So economy, government, education, energy. I know we're only supposed to have 3.
Yeah. Well, there's I'm sure a lot more beyond that too that we'd all like to work on.
Yeah.
Before we move off of your agenda a little bit too, I know that we're doing a little bit more of a get to know you than a policy discussion, but nonetheless, you did mention that we've been looking backwards too much and we're trying to recreate jobs from the past, and maybe that's a mistake. On the flip side of that argument, what should we be building? I mean, what should Maine become known for that it's not known for now? What types of jobs should we be chasing? What kind of industry should we be trying to create?
Look, Maine has a enormously powerful national brand as a place that's beautiful, hence our tourism, and as a place that produces quality, dependable, honest products. Now, we can thank L.L. Bean for that reputation, but it's also Stonewall Kitchen, Poland Spring, Tom's of Maine, Burt's Bees. a lot of products we export that are actually building the Maine brand. I want to extend that process. I want us to get behind people who are producing quality Maine products and shipping them to the world. The way the economy works, you and I know, but not everybody understands it. If all we're doing is circulating the money we already have around the table, around the community, we are not lifting incomes. The only way we lift incomes is to build things and send them somewhere else, out of state, that sends them money back in return. So I want us to become famous as a place that has a great environment for starting new businesses, for building new products, for supporting new ideas. I want us to turn the machinery of government away from bigger companies and yesterday's jobs and towards smaller companies and tomorrow's jobs. And I think if we could make ourselves famous as a kind of hot spot for new growth and new businesses, and a system that helps people move through the steps of doing that, we will attract lots of young entrepreneurial people from around the country, from around the world. So we need to add this to our brand now, and we need to be very intentional about it. And if there's anything that I would be known for as governor, it will be that.
So you've talked a little bit about your philosophy and your perspective on what you'd like to do, and you've also mentioned that in the past you grew up as a Kennedy Democrat, and you're running as an independent now.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the top that we might have an opportunity to talk about how that drift happened and where maybe they lost you along the way or whatever.
Yeah.
But what drove your move away from the Democratic Party? Why are you not running as a Democrat? Why did you end up becoming an independent?
Well, this work we've been discussing, reinventing government and Maine's next economy, is really what has had me drift away from the Democrats. I earlier said I consider myself a John F. Kennedy Democrat. John F. Kennedy was a pro-business guy.
Well, we like to always say that if he was alive today, he'd be a Republican, but I'm sure there's debate about that. But
he might be horrified also. We don't know. But look, the Democratic Party just does not talk about the economy enough. And when they talk about it, they don't talk about growing it. They talk about making it more fair. I'm for making the economy more fair, but I'm first and foremost for growing the economy. So that's one separation I've had from Democrats. When I released Reinventing Maine Government, it was in part to benefit my Democratic friends. Look, you got to know about this stuff.
Yeah.
You're getting killed on this stuff, and all you're doing is playing defense. Go on the offense. Figure out what the problems are. Tell Maine people you're going to fix them, and go fix them. And so that has caused, those two issues have caused a sort of a 10-year slow division between me and Democrats. Now, the decision to not be an active Democrat and to become an independent, that's a second step on my part. And look, here's what it comes down to. I don't think either party has put forward fundamentally new ideas in decades. I really don't. And I think the parties have become conformity machines. They hold these primaries and they spit out whoever will conform with whatever the latest trend is in the party. Now, the parties do it different ways. Republicans have been nominating sort of outsiders for a while who and with Sean, we heard, I'm gonna continue the policies of the page. Democrats have a different thing. They nominate insiders steeped in experience in government, and so when you do an analysis of those things, the outsiders kill the insiders. That's a pretty clear pattern, all the way up to this presidential race. Barack Obama before that. And in Maine, it's been clear. So I have assumed since a year ago that Democrats would nominate an insider with steeped in experience in government and who will repeat all of the slogans I've been hearing for decades. And Republicans would nominate somebody who would say all the same things that Paul LePage has said, would be an outsider, and would repeat all of the same mantras that that party repeats. Look, we're in a period of time in which change is happening faster than any other period in human history. We cannot succeed as a state by posting the same slogans we were doing 20 or 30 years ago. This is the other reason I became an independent is I respect and appreciate differences of opinion. I've been assembling these gatherings I mentioned earlier, 300, 350 people, in which people are listening to each other. And good ideas don't have a home address in one party or the other. They come from across the spectrum, as do good people. I like that rigor of listening to people that you don't agree with and seeing if you can find common ground. Mm-hmm. That is a skill that I've developed over time that I think will be enormously helpful to Maine if I'm governor. The ability to deal in a respectful way with lots of different ideas and different people and assemble the best of them to get done what we need to have done.
We're speaking with Alan Caron, who's an independent running for governor in the fall general election here, and is nice enough to talk to us a little bit more about what he's planning to do if he does become governor. You mentioned sort of your transition there, and one of the interesting things you just said, I think, is that the Democratic Party doesn't talk about growing the economy quite as much anymore. And I can't remember if it was you who told me this or someone else, but it seems to be a frequent refrain from people who actually kind of are in that Kennedy Democrat universe where, maybe they're a little bit on the older side and they remember a Democratic Party that was one way and it's drifted in a different direction. But one of the things I hear repeated a lot is that it doesn't feel like the Democratic Party talks to like the average, blue collar person anymore. It feels like whether you think the way they did it is good or bad, and there's a lot of criticisms that I think are fair of how they did it. It seems like the Republican Party has become the party of the machinist, the mechanic, the blue collar worker, and the Democrats have sort of gone into a different direction. I mean, do you share that opinion?
Yeah, I don't think it's that quite that black and white. But if you looked at election results in Maine, when Joe Brannon ran,
right,
in a blue-red map, Democrats had big blue circles in all of the mill towns.
Yeah, they did.
Right?
Well, Androscoggin County is a great example of that. Androscoggin County was the most democratic of democratic places, very Franco-American, very much mill towns. And LePage is cleaning house up there now in the last couple of elections. And I think that it'll probably continue with Moody this year. It just feels like the personality is shifting.
Actually began in Androscoggin County with Angus King's election.
Yeah.
Where he invested a bunch of time in Lewis and Auburn and took those areas. Joe Brennan never saw that coming. Mm-hmm. The Democrats didn't see it coming. So look, I think Democratic Party has not been speaking to or listening to blue-collar people in Maine for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean that, I know we can look at elections and we can say, well, now those people are voting Republican. Waterville went Republican, I think, Lewis and Auburn. I look at that group of voters as a group that wants change.
Yeah.
And they voted for Barack Obama in large numbers.
That is a good point.
And then they voted for Trump. So what is that telling you?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways has to be they're frustrated with the way things are. As a general concept, they don't feel well represented.
And look, we're all having to endure changes that aren't always easy. But I think they also feel they're not being listened to.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
And, I use as a perfect illustration, I've had this conversation with Democrats many times through the years. Somebody calls the state and they say, the guy beside me in the apartment near me is not working and he's getting welfare. Mm-hmm. I just want to report it. Should look into it. So the Democrats' response is, no, we've done a study. There are no problems with welfare. Everything's perfect. This is just a Republican plot, right? Okay, so what are you saying to the guy who's looking out his window?
Right.
What, you're calling him an idiot? Or what are you saying? So instead of saying, as I would, every big institution has problems. People cheat in every big system. We know that. That's why we have to constantly be vigilant. We have to constantly work to weed out slackers and free riders. And okay, we heard you loud and clear. We're going to work on that. Now let's talk about the economy, right?
Yeah.
I've been stunned that Democrats became the champions of the status quo in government.
Yeah.
While they're the agent of change, they like to think of themselves, and they are in many ways, an agent of change on social issues, on race, on the environment, an array of issues. They rightfully take some pride in being change agents. But when it comes to government, status quo. And again, why it's been, there isn't a place in the Democratic Party for people like me these days.
Yeah.
There isn't.
It does seem like quite a change, and over a pretty short amount of time, too. I mean, if you think back to Clinton, I mean, he's the guy who said the era of big government's over, and he's signing welfare reform and a number of government reform initiatives. I mean, government reform, whether it was welfare or somewhere else, it was a huge part of his personality as a president and when he was running for office, and the bridge to the 21st century and all that rhetoric. And where did that stuff go?
Yeah, and look at the Democrats who have won nationally. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. Both outsiders. Both running against their own party, not unlike what Trump did. Trump ran against a field of insiders, by and large. But look, I don't want to spend a lot of energy building a party, sustaining a party, or attacking a party. It's of little interest to me. I think we have great opportunities in the state to do some big things if we can get our act together. And you know what? This small state is competing with teams, highly organized teams. Call them states, call them countries, regions, all across the world for our best jobs. Those teams wake up every morning and try to figure out how to take our best jobs away from us. And we are locked in a kind of partisan, feudal nonsense, as far as I'm concerned. And as we do that, and it may be fun and games for some people, I get that. It's cage wrestling. But we are losing opportunities while that happens. And it's those opportunities that I'm focused on.
How do you really fix that, though? I mean, I have struggled with this every time I discuss, with a sort of an independent candidate for governor or an independent candidate for the legislature, sort of how you break the partisan system, because I don't think that many of us disagree with that it's tribal and it's ridiculous and it's not productive, right? Like, I mean, even the partisans a lot of the time agree with that. But it's also the way that it is. It seems like it's a Hatfields and McCoy's kind of thing where, every sort of slight is then returned in kind, and then there's another one right behind it.
Yeah, it's all built
you
up
become the governor, and you're an independent, and you've got these two people playing in the sandbox that is the legislature, and they're going to keep doing this kind of stuff, whether it's you or Sean or if it's, if it's anybody, right? Yeah. How do you break through that? Like, how do you actually get something done in that environment?
Well, look, I happen to believe, and maybe I'm just overly optimistic, that there remains a majority or close to it in both parties that are not ferociously partisan, that are not party first people.
I think that's probably true in the public, but do you think that that's true in the elected officials?
I think so.
And
I think if there's effective leadership that's respectful in bringing people together, I think we could do a lot more than we've been doing. This goes back to Paul LePage. And people say, "Oh, you've written a lot of harsh stuff about Paul LePage," and yes, I have. And but it isn't because I disagree with him on much of what he has worked on to reinvent government. I agree with much of it. I wrote a bunch of it. Where I have been disappointed is in all of the lost opportunities because we're busy doing partisan politics, not just Democrats, but also Republicans. So, again, to me, this kind of division is a luxury we can't afford. We just can't. And so I can't guarantee that we'll be singing Kumbaya around the campfire, but here's what I've demonstrated and what I can do. I do have an ability to bring people together who will trust that they will never be ambushed. I've done this again in these large gatherings many times. I believe that everyone should be heard. It should be limited so that everyone can be heard. And I believe we need leadership that doesn't focus us on where we disagree, but rather on where we could agree. And sometimes it's a small space, sometimes it's a big space. But if we get people focused there, we get more things done. Now, look, I'm not underestimating how big a job it is to do this. I know it will require all of my effort every day to do it. But I think part of what I'm touching on is a style of leadership that's more inclusive and more future focused than what we've had. You will never hear me insult people. Maybe I'll slip into it, and you can call me on it. But it's not the way I operate, and certainly not the way I mean to operate. I will never call state employees corrupt. I will never say teachers are a dime a dozen. It's just not the way I operate. And so I suppose above it all, we need a change in direction and tone in state government, and we need a style of leadership that goes beyond loud and angry.
I agree with most of that. I think one of the interesting questions to ask ourselves, though, is that when you look at, I would say mostly in the Republican Party, but even the Democrats to some degree, there seems to be an awful lot of anger that's boiling under and is generating a lot of the candidacies of people that have that kind of a reaction when they're confronted by stuff in state government and national government. And I guess the core question I have for you is there really a time in which you do kind of need to do that? I mean, that seems to be the frustration, is that there's some people are getting ripped off, taxpayers are having their money wasted, and their livelihoods are going down the drain because of poor decisions made by elitists in tiny little state capitals as they marvel at the marble sitting around them, right?
Yeah.
Is there a time in which you kind of just have to take the unvarnished truth approach, and maybe you are not insulting about it, but you do kind of have to confront it strongly?
Yeah. Well, look, I've tried to do that. So in the Reinventing Maine government was a great example. I didn't, if there ever was an unvarnished, nonpartisan book about government in Maine, I think that was it. That's what I tried to do anyway. And I didn't really concern myself with whether an idea was embraced by a Democrat or Republican, or where it came from and whose platform it was in. I tried to just wipe that stuff off the slate and deal with facts as much as we could know facts. And so anyone who's known me for any period of time knows that I can be a really nice guy. I can really be collaborative. But I also know sometimes that's not enough for everyone, and we have to be. You've got to be tough as a governor. There's no question about it. 90% of the people coming to Augusta are looking for something. Right? This is true for the legislature.
Might be lowballing it a little bit.
yeah, maybe they're looking for something. We can't give all of those things that people want as a government. We can do more in education. We could do more, I think, in healthcare, but only if we grow the economy and shrink government. Otherwise, there isn't money to say yes to all of the people who are asking. There isn't. I found it entertaining doing a lot of these debates in front of different interest groups. And, candidates will say, yeah, whatever you're asking for, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And then you move to the next one, and the next one, and the next one is...
So whatever you're asking for, I'm going to do, right?
So I always stop my thing with, I'll never say something here that I won't say in the next meeting.
Yeah.
And I'm only going to promise what I think I could actually deliver, which is not going to be what you want necessarily. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't. That's sort of an accident when it is. But for instance, on education, I'm for getting us to the 55% state funding. But I want the added money to go in the classroom. I don't want it to go anywhere else. I just want it to go in the classroom because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where things happen. And the idea that we have teachers, and good friends of mine also, 8th grade, 7th grade teachers, they're spending money out of their own pocket for supplies. That can't happen. That can't happen. So I think it's one of the most important jobs in the society, and we gotta treat it that way. But again, you can't say no to all. You can't say yes to all these things unless you can tell me where the money comes from. And all I can tell you is we know if we grow the economy, more revenues come into government. Doesn't mean we have to spend them all.
Yeah.
We could trim our income taxes further. I like that idea. But we could also invest more in on the education side. We need to retool the workforce in Maine for a 21st century economy. We're a long way from it.
Yeah.
And that starts in pre-K. It goes all the way K through 12. I've proposed a plan that some people think is a big spending plan. It isn't when you look at the details. But I want everyone to have an opportunity for up to 2 years of free college in the state. And I mean by college, community college, also trade schools, skill training. And here's the deal. We'll taxpayers of Maine will make a deal with you. We'll stand behind a 10-year loan, standard interest rate loan, student loan. And for every year you stay and work in Maine, we'll defer the payments and we'll take 10% of the principal away. If you stay and work in Maine for 10 years, you just got 2 years of free higher education of your choosing. Of course, along the way, from the taxpayer's standpoint, you paid income tax, you paid sales tax, you paid excise tax, and in one way or another, you paid property tax. So it ends up being a kind of a wash for taxpayers, but it helps young people stay here. It attracts more young people, and it helps mid-career people retool themselves, retrain, build new skills. So those are the kind of innovative things I think we can do, but we gotta find the money to do them. And again, that's from growing government and growing the economy, making government smarter and smaller.
We've been speaking with Alan Caron, who's an independent candidate running for governor, and is giving us his vision of where he'd like to take the state. I guess we're a little out of time here, so I do have just one short question to ask you, I guess, to wrap up before we let you go. And that's more or less a question and more just a request. For the people who've been listening, they've gotten a good part of your background, gotten a little bit of the philosophy, got a couple ideas out of you. But give me your elevator pitch. What is it that is the argument for Alan Caron for governor? Why should people vote for you?
Look, if you think that everything has been going just fine in Maine, and you're satisfied with what we've been doing over the last 20 years, you really should vote for one of the party nominees. If you think we can do better, if you think we need more civility, if you think we need to build a new kind of economy in Maine from the bottom up, if you think we need a governor who gets it about government becoming more efficient, I'm your guy.
That is an elevator pitch. I love it. Thanks so much. Alan Caron, independent candidate for governor, has spent some time with us this morning. Really appreciate it, Alan. And, of course, we're doing this with all the other candidates as well. So if you haven't seen the ones that we've already released, definitely go ahead and check them out. They'll be at WGAN.com and more are upcoming. So thanks again, Alan.
Well, thank you.
Look for more from WGAN.